The night my triplets came home from London was supposed to be the happiest night of my life. For 8 years, I had imagined this moment while scrubbing hotel floors, sewing clothes past midnight, and skipping meals so I could send them money. I stood in my tiny Ohio kitchen wearing a faded apron, stirring the soup they used to love as children. Then the front door opened. They walked in with a tall, well-dressed man I had never seen before. He looked at me confused and asked, "Wait, I thought you said your mom owned this house, so who's the maid?" My daughter Claire didn't hesitate. "Oh, she just takes care of the house." Ryan said nothing. Luke looked away. And in that moment, standing in the kitchen of the home I sacrificed everything to keep, I realized something terrifying. The children I gave my life to no longer saw me as their mother. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something. Have you ever given everything to someone only to have them treat you like you meant nothing? If this story touches you in any way, take a second to like this video. It helps stories like mine reach people who might need to hear them. And I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Tell me your city and what time it is there. Reading your comments reminds me that none of us are truly alone in what we go through. Now, let me tell you how everything began. My name is Carol Anderson, and for most of my life, I have been just an ordinary woman trying to survive in Columbus, Ohio. There was a time when my life looked different. I used to believe in simple things, family dinners, laughter in the living room, the idea that if you worked hard and loved your children enough, everything would somehow turn out okay. But life has a strange way of testing that belief. When my triplets were 6 years old, their father walked out of our lives. His name was Michael Anderson. For years, I told people he had simply left, but the truth was more complicated than that. Michael didn't leave in one dramatic moment. He left slowly, one missed dinner at a time, one cold argument at a time, one night sleeping on the couch instead of beside me. And then one morning, he packed a suitcase and said he couldn't live like this anymore. "This life isn't what I want," he told me. I still remember the look in Ryan's eyes when he asked where Daddy was going. I remember Claire clutching my arm, refusing to let go. Luke, the youngest by 3 minutes, just stood in the doorway confused. Michael kissed their foreheads and promised he'd stay in touch. He didn't. After he left, the house felt impossibly quiet. The silence was the kind that echoes through your bones. But quiet didn't last long, because 3 children need food, clothes, school supplies, and 1,000 other things that life demands whether you're ready or not. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I worked. My morning started before sunrise. At 5:30 every morning, I walked 3 blocks to the Hayes Grand Hotel, where I worked as a housekeeper. The smell of cleaning chemicals became so familiar that sometimes I swear I could still smell it even when I was home. My job was simple: clean 12 rooms before noon, strip beds, scrub bathrooms, vacuum carpets, smile politely when guests walked by as if I were invisible. By the time I finished, my back usually felt like it had aged 10 years. But my day was far from over. At 4 in the afternoon, I changed uniforms and went to the diner on Maple Street where I worked as a waitress. The place was always busy with truck drivers, office workers, and college kids looking for cheap coffee. I balanced trays, memorized orders, and forced myself to keep smiling no matter how tired I felt. Then, after the diner closed at 10, I went home and sat at the small sewing machine in our living room. For years, I took sewing jobs from neighbors, hemming dresses, repairing jackets, altering curtains. Sometimes I worked until 2 in the morning while the house slept around me. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept the lights on. Through all of it, my children were the reason I kept going. Raising triplets is like living in a storm that never completely settles. Every moment is loud, chaotic, and full of motion. But they were also the greatest joy of my life. Ryan, my oldest son by a few minutes, was always the calm one. Even as a little boy, he had a thoughtful seriousness about him. While other kids ran around shouting, Ryan preferred puzzles, books, and anything that challenged his mind. Teachers constantly told me he was gifted. Claire was different. She had a fire in her personality that you could feel the moment she entered a room. Claire loved competition. Whether it was debate club, class elections, or school presentations, she always wanted to be the best. Sometimes I worried that her ambition burned a little too brightly, but I was also proud of her strength. Then there was Luke. Luke was the heart of our family. Where Ryan was thoughtful and Claire was driven, Luke was warm and playful. He had a way of making people laugh even when things were hard. If he saw me coming home exhausted from work, he'd rush over to hug me like I was the most important person in the world. Those hugs kept me going on days when my body felt like it might collapse. From the time they were young, I told my children the same thing over and over again. Education is the one thing no one can ever take from you. I didn't have money to give them. I didn't have property or investments or trust funds. But I believed education could give them a life bigger than the one I had lived. So while other parents spent money on vacations or luxuries, I saved every extra dollar for their future, and my children never disappointed me. They studied harder than I ever expected. Ryan won academic competitions. Claire earned leadership awards. Luke balanced school with part-time jobs and still managed to keep his grades high. When they were in high school, their teachers started talking about universities overseas. At first, the idea sounded impossible. But one afternoon during their senior year, the three of them came home with news that changed everything. They had been accepted into an international academic program connected to a university in London. All three of them. I still remember standing in our small kitchen holding the letter in my hands. The words on the page blurred through my tears. London. It sounded like another world. But the program came with an incredible opportunity. They had each received partial scholarships. The scholarships covered a significant portion of tuition, but not everything. There were still living expenses, housing, books, travel. Even with the scholarships, the cost was far beyond anything I had ever imagined paying. That night after dinner, we sat around the kitchen table together, the same table where we had eaten thousands of meals over the years. Ryan spoke first. "Mom, we know it's a lot of money." Claire quickly added, "We don't expect you to say yes." Luke looked at me quietly, as if he already knew how much I was struggling to think. I stared at the acceptance letters spread across the table. 3 chances. 3 doors opening at once. Opportunities like this didn't come twice in a lifetime. My heart was racing, but deep down, I already knew my answer. I looked at my children, the 3 people I loved more than anything in the world, and I said the words that would change my life forever. "We'll find a way." Ryan's eyes widened. Claire covered her mouth in disbelief. Luke jumped out of his chair and hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. "Mom, are you serious?" I nodded. I didn't know how. I didn't know what it would cost. But I knew one thing for certain. If my children had the chance to build a life bigger than the one I had struggled through, I would do whatever it took to give it to them. What I didn't know then was that the price of that decision would be far greater than money. Once I said those words, asterisk, "we'll find a way, asterisk," there was no turning back. At the time, the excitement in my children's eyes made everything feel possible. Ryan immediately started talking about the academic opportunities in London. Claire was already researching internships and networking programs overseas. Luke, ever the dreamer, said he wanted to walk along the Thames and see the old libraries he had only read about in books. I sat there smiling, nodding, encouraging them. But inside my mind was racing, because I knew the truth. We didn't have a way. Not yet. That night, after the kids went to bed, I stayed up at the kitchen table with a calculator, a stack of papers, and 3 acceptance packets spread in front of me. Tuition after scholarships, housing, food, books, health insurance, flights. The numbers felt like they were climbing higher every minute. By the time I finished calculating, the total cost for all 3 of them made my stomach twist. It was more money than I'd ever seen in my life. For a moment, doubt crept in. I looked around our small house, the peeling paint near the hallway, the old refrigerator humming in the corner, the worn carpet in the living room. This house had carried us through everything. And suddenly, I realized it might have to carry us through one more sacrifice. The next morning, I started making calls. First, I spoke with the financial aid office at the university in London. They explained the details of the scholarships again. The aid was generous, they said, but there were limits. International programs were expensive, and the rest would have to come from personal funds. Then I called banks. Most of them rejected my loan applications immediately. A single mother working service jobs didn't look like a safe investment to them, but I kept calling. Eventually, one bank agreed to offer a loan if I used my house as collateral. The word asterisk, collateral asterisk sat heavy in my chest. If anything went wrong, if I couldn't keep up with payments, we could lose the only home my children had ever known. I sat in the bank parking lot for almost an hour after that conversation. The logical part of me whispered that it was too dangerous. But every time doubt appeared, another thought pushed it away. Asterisk. This is their future. So I kept moving forward. The first thing I sold was my car. It wasn't anything fancy, just an old sedan that had carried me to work for years. But it was reliable, and letting it go meant I would have to walk or take buses everywhere. Still, it brought in a few $1,000s. Next, I withdrew the small retirement account I had been building for almost 15 years. Watching that account disappear was harder than I expected. That money represented the tiny hope that one day I might slow down and rest. But dreams of retirement felt small compared to the future my children could have. Then there was my wedding ring. I hadn't worn it since Michael left, but I had kept it tucked safely inside a small jewelry box in my dresser. Selling it felt like closing the last chapter of a life that had already ended. The jeweler examined the ring carefully under bright lights before naming his price. It wasn't nearly as much as Michael had once paid for it, but it was enough to help. Little by little, piece by piece, the money came together. The bank loan, the car, the retirement fund, the ring. Savings I had hidden away for emergencies. By the end of that month, I had gathered enough to send the first round of payments. But making that decision changed everything about my life. Without a car, my mornings started even earlier. I woke up at 5 and walked through the cold Ohio air to the Hayes Grand Hotel. Some days, the winter wind felt like it was cutting through my coat. After my shift ended, I took the bus across town to the diner. Sometimes I barely made it home before midnight. And yet, strangely enough, I didn't feel miserable. Because every time I thought about quitting, I imagined my children walking through the halls of a university in London. That image carried me forward. The months passed quickly. Soon it was time for the trip. The day we drove to the airport is still burned into my memory. Ryan sat in the front seat beside me, staring out the window quietly. Claire kept checking the documents in her bag, making sure she hadn't forgotten anything. Luke talked the entire ride, bouncing between excitement and nervousness. When we reached the airport, everything suddenly felt real. Crowds rushed past us. Suitcases rolled across the polished floor. Announcements echoed over the speakers. I helped them check their bags, even though my hands were shaking. Then we stood together near the security line. For a moment, none of us spoke. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. "Mom, thank you for believing in us." Claire hugged me tightly, something she hadn't done in years. "You're the reason we can do this," she said. Luke wrapped both of his arms around me, nearly lifting me off the ground. "We're going to make you proud," he promised. Tears blurred my vision as I held them. "You already have," I whispered. Before they stepped into the security line, Ryan turned back and said something I will never forget. "Mom, when we come back, everything will be different." Claire nodded. "You won't have to work like this anymore." Luke smiled. "We'll take care of you the way you took care of us." Those words stayed with me long after their plane disappeared into the sky. For the first few weeks after they left, the house felt unbearably empty. Triplets bring constant noise into a home, laughter arguments, music footsteps. Without them, the silence felt like a heavy blanket covering everything. But that silence also carried hope, because I believed every sacrifice I had made was building something better for them and for us. What I didn't realize back then was that while my children were discovering a new world overseas, something else was quietly changing inside them, something that would eventually make them ashamed of the life they once came from. For the first year after my children moved to London, everything felt like the beginning of a dream finally coming true. They called me constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. The time difference made things a little tricky. When they were just finishing their day, I was usually getting ready to start mine, but we made it work. Most nights after I finished my shift at the diner, I would come home, heat up a cup of tea, and sit at the kitchen table with my phone waiting for it to ring. When Ryan called, the conversations were thoughtful and detailed. He talked about professors who challenged his ideas about economic theories I barely understood, and about group projects where he quickly became the natural leader. "Mom, the professors here expect a lot," he once told me, excitement clear in his voice. But I like it. It pushes me. I could hear the pride in his tone. Claire's calls were always full of energy. She told me about debate competitions, networking events, and internships that students competed fiercely to get. She spoke about London like it was a giant stage where everyone was trying to prove they belonged. "You wouldn't believe the people here, Mom," she said one evening. Some of them grew up around politicians and CEOs. There was always a spark in her voice when she talked about those circles. Then there was Luke. Luke's calls were the warmest. He told me about street musicians along the Thames late-night study sessions with classmates and the tiny coffee shop near campus where he liked to sit and read. "Mom, you'd love this place," he told me once. "It smells like cinnamon and old books." Sometimes during those calls, I would close my eyes and try to imagine the world they were living in. Old stone buildings, historic libraries, busy streets filled with accents from every corner of the world. It felt like my children had stepped into a life far bigger than the one I had known. And I was proud, so proud. But even in that first year, small changes began to appear. At first they were so subtle I barely noticed them. Ryan began correcting the way I pronounced certain words. "Mom, it's actually pronounced differently," he would say gently. "People here would laugh if you said it like that." He meant it as advice, but every correction reminded me how far apart our worlds were becoming. Claire's changes were more noticeable. One night, during a video call, she wrinkled her nose slightly when the camera angle showed part of our kitchen behind me. "Mom, you still haven't replaced that old refrigerator?" she asked. I laughed it off. "It still works," Claire shrugged. "Yeah, but it looks kind of outdated." The word lingered in the air between us. Outdated. Like the house. Like the life we had lived. Luke rarely said things like that. But he did begin asking for money more often. At first, the requests made sense. Books were expensive. Housing in London cost far more than we had expected. Sometimes his messages arrived late at night. "Mom, I hate to ask, but my laptop died. I need it for classes." Or, "There's a networking event this weekend. Professors say it's important. I need to buy a ticket." Every time those messages arrived, I found a way to send something. Sometimes it meant skipping groceries for a week. Sometimes it meant taking extra sewing work. But I told myself it was temporary. Just a few more years. And then they would graduate. And then everything would change. Around the middle of their second year overseas, a new name began appearing in their stories. Victoria Bennett. The first time Ryan mentioned her, it sounded like nothing unusual. "She's a businesswoman who runs mentorship programs for international students," he explained during one of our calls. "She connects people with internships and industry leaders." Claire sounded even more impressed. "Mom, you have no idea how powerful she is," she said. "Everyone wants to be invited to her events." Apparently, Victoria hosted gatherings where students could meet investors, executives, and entrepreneurs, people who could open doors. At first, I thought it sounded wonderful. If someone influential was helping my children build connections, that could only be a good thing. But as the months passed, something about the way they talked about her began to change. Ryan started mentioning her advice during our conversations. "Victoria says people need to present themselves properly if they want to succeed." Claire spoke about the social expectations of the circles she was entering. "Image matters here, Mom. People judge you by how you carry yourself." Luke once told me that Victoria had helped him meet students from extremely wealthy families. "They live in a completely different world," he said almost in awe. Little by little, their stories became less about classes and more about status, networking, influence, opportunity. At first, I thought it was simply part of growing up, but then the phone calls started becoming shorter. Instead of an hour, they lasted 15 minutes. Instead of long conversations, I received quick updates. Ryan often sounded distracted, as if he were juggling too many responsibilities. Claire frequently mentioned events she needed to attend. Luke sometimes texted instead of calling. Weeks passed between our conversations. I tried not to let it hurt me. After all, they were busy building their futures. But sometimes late at night when the house was silent, I found myself staring at my phone, wondering if I had already begun to disappear from their lives. Still, whenever they needed help, I was there. More than once, unexpected expenses appeared. A housing deposit, professional clothing for an internship, travel costs for academic conferences. Every time they asked, I told myself the same thing. Asterisk. This is an investment in their future. But slowly, without fully realizing it, the tone of our relationship was shifting. Advice became instruction. Gratitude became expectation. And somewhere across an ocean I had never seen my children were beginning to learn a different way of measuring success. A way that quietly placed the life I had given them at the very bottom. What I didn't understand yet was that someone was helping shape that new way of thinking. Someone who believed that people like me, people who cleaned hotel rooms and worked double shifts, were the kind of past successful people should leave behind. And my children were listening. By the time my children had been in London for 3 years, my life had settled into a rhythm that revolved entirely around supporting them. Every dollar I earned had a purpose. Every hour I worked had a destination. And that destination was always the same, an account that allowed Ryan, Claire, and Luke to continue building the lives they were creating overseas. From the outside, my days probably looked exhausting, but strangely enough, I had grown used to the pace. I woke up before sunrise. The streets of Columbus were quiet at that hour, the sky still dark when I stepped outside and began my walk to the Hayes Grand Hotel. The cold Ohio air had a sharp bite in winter, and sometimes my breath floated in front of me like smoke as I hurried down the sidewalk. Cleaning hotel rooms had never been glamorous work, but after years of doing it, my hands moved almost automatically. Strip the beds, wipe every surface, scrub the bathroom tiles, replace the towels, 12 rooms every morning, sometimes more if someone called in sick. My back ached constantly, but I rarely complained. Because every time I felt tired, I reminded myself why I was doing it. After my shift at the hotel ended, I usually grabbed a cheap sandwich from a corner store before heading to the diner on Maple Street. The diner was louder, brighter, and full of constant motion. Plates clattered, coffee machines hissed. Customers called out orders. I learned how to carry 3 plates on one arm and refill coffee cups without spilling a drop. Some customers were kind. Others treated waitresses like we were invisible. But tips paid the bills, so I smiled through everything. When the diner finally closed around 10 at night, most people would have gone home to rest. But my day still wasn't over. I walked back to my small house, made a quick cup of tea, and sat down at the sewing machine that had become my third job. Over the years, word had spread through the neighborhood that I was good with a needle and thread. People brought me all kinds of work. Torn jackets, curtains that needed altering, wedding dresses that needed adjusting. Sometimes I sewed until 2 in the morning while the rest of the city slept. My fingers often ached from the constant motion, but every stitch was another small contribution toward my children's future. The hardest part wasn't the work. The hardest part was the silence. Without the triplets in the house, the rooms felt larger and emptier than they had ever been before. Ryan's bedroom still had the same bookshelf lined with science magazines. Claire's walls still carried faint marks from the posters she had hung during high school. Luke's old basketball sat in the corner of the living room where he had left it years earlier. I never moved any of those things. Keeping them exactly where they were made the house feel like my children might walk through the door at any moment, even if that moment was years away. During those years, I tried my best to stay connected with them, but the distance between us was growing in ways I didn't fully understand. They were changing. Their voices sounded more confident, more polished. Sometimes their accents even shifted slightly after spending so much time abroad. Ryan talked about internships with consulting firms. Claire mentioned attending business conferences and private networking events. Luke began spending time with students whose families owned companies and investment firms. Their lives were expanding quickly. Mine stayed the same. Still, whenever one of them needed something, they knew they could call me. And those calls came often. One evening, Luke called sounding frustrated. "Mom, I hate to ask this, but I need a new laptop," he said. "What happened to the old one?" I asked. "It crashed completely. I can't even turn it on anymore." "How much does a new one cost?" There was a pause. "About $1,800. My heart skipped. That was nearly 2 weeks of my income, but I didn't let that hesitation reach my voice. "Okay," I said gently. "Give me a few days." After we hung up, I sat quietly at the kitchen table staring at my bank account. The numbers were smaller than I liked. But 3 days later, Luke received the money. Another time, Claire called with excitement in her voice. "Mom, I got invited to this incredible networking event," she said. "Some major investors will be there." "That sounds wonderful," I replied. "There's just one thing," she continued. "The ticket costs £300. I didn't even know exactly how much that was in dollars. But I told her the same thing I always did. We'll figure it out. Every time they needed something, I found a way. Sometimes it meant skipping meals for a few days. Sometimes it meant taking extra sewing jobs that kept me awake until dawn. But I never told them how hard it was. I didn't want them to feel guilty, because guilt might distract them from the opportunities they were chasing. Still, there were moments when small pieces of truth slipped through the cracks. One winter morning, I fainted while cleaning a hotel bathroom. 1 minute, I was scrubbing the floor tiles. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the ground with 2 coworkers leaning over me. "Carol, you scared us," one of them said. Apparently, I had collapsed from exhaustion. The hotel manager insisted I go to the hospital to get checked. The doctor told me something I already suspected. "You're severely overworked," he said. "Your body needs rest." I nodded politely, but resting wasn't an option, not when 3 futures depended on me. So I returned to work 2 days later and never told my children what had happened. If they asked how I was doing, I simply said the same thing. I'm fine. Because what mother tells her children, that she's falling apart just to support them. Over time, though, I began to notice something unsettling. The way my children spoke about money was changing. They talked about expensive restaurants as if they were normal. They described luxury apartments their friends lived in. Sometimes they casually mentioned things that cost more than my monthly salary. Once during a phone call, Claire laughed while describing the lifestyle of one of her classmates. His parents bought him a penthouse apartment, she said. Can you imagine? I forced a laugh. That must be nice. Claire didn't sound amazed. She sounded like she thought it was natural. And that was the moment a quiet thought crossed my mind. My children were learning how wealthy people lived, but they were also learning how wealthy people judged the world. And somewhere deep down I wondered if they would still recognize the value of the life they had come from, or if one day they would begin to see it as something embarrassing. 8 years. That's how long my children lived in London. 8 years of long-distance phone calls, money transfers, and quiet nights in a house that had once been full of noise. 8 years of telling myself that every sacrifice would eventually lead to something beautiful. And when Ryan finally called to tell me they were coming home, I felt something inside my chest bloom with a kind of happiness I hadn't experienced in years. Mommy said over the phone one evening, our contracts are ending soon. Claire and Luke and I decided it's time to come back to the States. I had to sit down when I heard that. You're coming home, I asked, almost afraid I had misunderstood. For a while, at least, he said. There are opportunities here. Daniel's exploring some partnerships in the U.S., and we want to see what we can build. Daniel. The name had appeared more often during the last year of their time abroad. Daniel Bennett, the son of Victoria Bennett. Ryan described him as brilliant. Claire called him incredibly connected. Luke once mentioned that Daniel's family owned multiple companies across Europe. To be honest, I didn't fully understand the world my children had stepped into. But if they were coming home, that was all that mattered to me. For the first time in years, the house felt alive again. The moment I hung up the phone, I started preparing. I cleaned every room from top to bottom. I washed the curtains. I polished the old wooden dining table where we had shared so many meals when the kids were young. The house wasn't fancy. The paint on the walls had faded in places and the furniture showed its age. But it was clean, and it was filled with memories. I wanted everything to feel welcoming when they walked through the door again. Then there was the food. Every child has certain dishes that remind them of home. Ryan loved homemade chicken soup. Claire adored my baked pasta casserole. Luke could eat my cinnamon apple pie faster than anyone I had ever seen. So I spent the entire day cooking. The kitchen filled with warm smells that reminded me of earlier years. For a while, as I stirred soup on the stove and rolled dough for the pie, it almost felt like time had reversed. Like the kids would come running down the hallway at any moment, arguing about whose turn it was to wash dishes. But the reality was different. When they finally arrived, they weren't children anymore. Late that afternoon, I heard a car pull up outside the house. My heart began racing. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked toward the front door just as it opened. Ryan stepped in first. He looked taller, somehow more polished than I remembered. His clothes were expensive and perfectly tailored. Claire followed behind him, wearing a sleek coat and heels that clicked sharply against the floor. Luke came in next, smiling the same warm smile I remembered from his childhood. And behind them stood a man I had never seen before. Tall, confident, dressed in a dark coat that probably cost more than my monthly income. Ryan spoke first. Mom. For a moment, everything else disappeared. I rushed forward and wrapped my arms around him. He hugged me back, though his embrace felt brief and slightly awkward. Claire accepted my hug politely. Luke held me a little longer, and for a second I felt a flash of the boy he used to be. Then Ryan stepped aside. Mom, this is Daniel Bennett, he said. The tall man extended his hand with a polite smile. Nice to meet you, Mrs. Anderson. I shook his hand, trying not to feel self-conscious about the flour still on my fingers from baking. Welcome, I said warmly. Please come in. They walked into the house looking around, and that was when I began noticing the small things. Claire's eyes moved slowly across the living room. Ryan glanced toward the ceiling as if evaluating something. Daniel remained polite, but his expression carried the calm curiosity of someone visiting a place far outside his normal environment. Luke was the only one who smiled. "Smells amazing in here," he said. "I made your favorites," I replied quickly. "Dinner's almost ready." For a moment, everything seemed normal. Then Daniel turned toward Ryan and asked something that froze the entire room. "Wait," he said casually. "I thought you said your mom owned the house." Ryan hesitated. Just slightly. Then Daniel looked at me. His gaze traveled from my faded apron to my flour-covered hands. "So," he said slowly, "are you the maid?" The question hung in the air like a sudden storm. For a second, I thought someone would laugh and correct him. But no one did. Instead, Claire spoke. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "Oh," she said lightly, "she just takes care of things around here." My chest tightened. I looked at Ryan. He didn't say anything. Luke shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. And just like that, something inside me cracked. 8 years of sacrifice. 8 years of believing my children would return grateful, proud, loving. All of it collided with a single sentence. "She just takes care of things." I stood there in the kitchen doorway, holding a wooden spoon, suddenly unsure where I belonged in my own home. Ryan quickly changed the subject. "Dinner smells great, Mom." But the moment had already passed, and something had already changed. That night, as we sat down at the table together for the first time in nearly a decade, I tried to pretend everything was normal. But deep inside, a quiet voice had started whispering something I didn't want to believe. My children hadn't just come back different. They had come back ashamed of the life they had once called home. What I didn't realize yet was that the worst part of the night hadn't even happened. Because later that evening, I would accidentally overhear a conversation that revealed the real reason they had returned. And it had nothing to do with family. Dinner that night should have been warm and joyful. Instead, it felt like sitting at a table with strangers. I tried to ignore the moment in the kitchen earlier, the moment when Daniel Bennett had mistaken me for the maid, and Claire had quietly allowed it. Maybe it had just been an awkward misunderstanding. Maybe they were tired from traveling. Maybe I was reading too much into things. That's what I kept telling myself as I placed the dishes on the table. The chicken soup steamed gently in the large bowl. The baked pasta casserole sat golden and bubbling in the center. And Luke's favorite cinnamon apple pie waited on the counter for dessert. For a moment, the smell of the food almost made the house feel like it used to. "Everything looks great," Mom Luke said, giving me a small smile as he took his seat. Ryan sat across from him, already checking something on his phone. Claire adjusted the sleeve of her expensive jacket before placing her napkin carefully on her lap. Daniel sat beside Ryan, looking politely interested in everything. "I served the soup first." Ryan tasted it and nodded. "Still the same," he said. I couldn't tell whether he meant it as a compliment. Claire took a few bites of the casserole before speaking. "So, Mom," she said casually, glancing around the room, "have you ever thought about renovating this place?" I blinked. "Renovating?" "Yeah," she continued. "The house has potential, but it's kind of outdated." That word again. Outdated. Ryan looked up from his phone. "The neighborhood is improving," he added. "Property values could increase if you upgraded a few things." Daniel leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. "It's actually not a bad location," he said. "With the right investment, this place could be worth a lot more." Their conversation sounded less like family dinner and more like a business meeting. I tried to keep my voice light. "Well, the house has served us well for a long time," I said. "I've never really thought about changing much." Claire exchanged a quick glance with Ryan. Luke kept eating quietly. For the rest of the meal, the conversation drifted between stories from London and vague mentions of business opportunities. Ryan talked about consulting projects he had worked on. Claire described investors she had met through Victoria Bennett's events. Daniel spoke confidently about international markets and expansion plans. I listened politely, though much of it felt like another language. Eventually, the dinner ended. Luke helped me carry the dishes to the kitchen while the others moved into the living room. "You okay, Mom?" Luke asked softly. I forced a smile. "Of course." But he looked at me for a moment longer, as if he sensed something beneath the surface. Then he carried the last plate out and joined the others. After the dishes were washed, I wiped my hands on a towel and walked toward the living room. But before I entered, I heard voices. Ryan's voice, clear and serious. "We just have to present it the right way." I stopped, not intentionally, but something in his tone made me pause. Claire spoke next. Exactly. If she thinks we're trying to take the house, she'll panic. Take the house. My heart skipped. Daniel's voice joined the conversation. You're overthinking it, he said calmly. Just frame it as a strategic move. Ryan sighed. You don't understand. She's emotionally attached to this place. Claire sounded impatient. That's the problem. My hand tightened around the hallway wall. Luke finally spoke. Maybe we should just ask her what she wants, he said. There was a short silence. Then Claire laughed softly. Luke, please. This house is basically dead capital. Dead capital. Daniel continued sounding almost amused. She's sitting on a property that could fund an entire startup. Ryan spoke again. That's why we need her to sell. Sell. The word echoed in my head. Claire leaned forward, her voice lowering slightly. If she sells the house, we could pool the money. Daniel added smoothly, with the right investment strategy, that capital could turn into something much bigger. Ryan continued the thought. We launch the company here in the States. It gives us a base. Claire's tone sharpened. And we wouldn't have to worry about image anymore. Daniel chuckled quietly. Exactly. Luke sounded uneasy. But where would Mom live? Claire sighed. Somewhere smaller, Ryan added. There are nice senior living communities, comfortable places. Senior living. I felt like the air had been knocked out of my lungs. They were planning my future like a business arrangement. The house I had fought to keep for decades. The house where they had grown up. To them, it was just an asset, something to liquidate, something to convert into investment capital. Luke spoke again, more quietly this time. I don't know. This feels wrong. Claire's voice hardened. Luke, we're not doing anything wrong. Ryan nodded. She sacrificed a lot so we could succeed, Daniel added calmly. This is just the next step in that sacrifice. I felt something inside me shatter. Sacrifice. They were talking about my life as if it were an obligation, as if everything I had given them was simply expected. Then Ryan said something that made my stomach twist. I already spoke with a legal consultant, he said. There's a way to structure it so she signs over temporary control of the property. Claire sounded interested. Power of attorney. Something like that, Ryan replied. Just until we get the business established. Daniel laughed softly. You guys think too small. With the right capital, you could scale much faster. Luke didn't say anything. And in that silence, I finally understood something painful. My children hadn't come home because they missed me. They had come home because they needed something from me, something they believed belonged to them. My house, my last piece of security, my life. I quietly stepped away from the hallway before anyone noticed I was listening. My legs felt weak as I walked back into the kitchen. The same kitchen where only hours earlier I had been cooking their favorite meals, dreaming about family dinners and laughter. Instead, I stood there alone in the dim light. And for the first time since they were born, a terrifying question entered my mind. Had I spent my entire life sacrificing for people who no longer saw me as their mother, but only as a resource? Because if what I had just heard was true, then the children I loved more than anything in the world were planning to take the only thing I had left, and they believed I would simply give it to them. That night I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling while the quiet house creaked softly around me. For years, that silence had been lonely, but that night it felt heavy with something else. Realization. Everything I had overheard in the hallway replayed in my mind again and again. Dead capital. Asterisk sell the house. Asterisk temporary control. My children hadn't returned home because they missed me. They had returned because they needed something from me. And somehow that hurt even more than the moment Claire had let Daniel believe I was the maid. At around 3 a.m, I gave up trying to sleep and went into the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had cooked their welcome dinner just hours earlier. The soup pot was still sitting on the stove. Half the casserole remained in the dish. 3 plates waited in the drying rack beside the sink. For a long moment, I just stood there looking at the room. So many memories lived in this space. Ryan doing homework at the table. Claire practicing speeches for debate competitions. Luke sneaking pieces of apple pie before dinner. Every corner of the house carried the story of our lives together. And now to them it was just an asset, something to convert into money. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think about something I had been avoiding. Money. Not the money I had sent them. The money I still had left. Because the truth was, despite everything I had sacrificed, I wasn't completely helpless. But my children didn't know that. And I had never intended for them to. Many years earlier, something unexpected had happened in my life. Something that changed my financial situation in a quiet but important way. Back when the triplets were still in elementary school, I had been working at the Hayes Grand Hotel for only a few months. At the time, the hotel was owned by a woman named Margaret Hayes. She was a sharp, elegant woman who rarely appeared on the main floors. Most of the staff only saw her occasionally during meetings or inspections. But one afternoon, something unusual happened. I was cleaning one of the executive suites when I overheard an argument in the hallway. Two men were speaking in low, tense voices. At first, I tried to ignore it. Hotel staff learn quickly not to involve themselves in situations that don't concern them. But then I heard something that made my stomach drop. One of the men was threatening to release financial documents that could ruin Margaret Hayes' company. Blackmail. I didn't know all the details, but the tone of the conversation was unmistakable. Later that day, I made a difficult decision. I requested a meeting with Mrs. Hayes and told her exactly what I had overheard. For a moment, I worried I might lose my job for interfering, but instead, Margaret Hayes listened carefully. A few weeks later, the situation was resolved quietly. The man who had been making threats disappeared from the hotel's business dealings, and Margaret Hayes called me into her office. "I don't forget loyalty," she told me. At the time, I thought she was simply thanking me. But what she did next surprised me. She offered me something I barely understood at the time. A small ownership stake in a new hotel expansion project. "It's not a salary increase," she explained. "It's an investment." The percentage was small, very small. At the time, it didn't seem like much. But over the years, that investment grew. Slowly, quietly. I never talked about it with anyone, not even my children, because I wanted them to grow up believing that hard work mattered more than money. And I didn't want them making decisions based on the idea that their mother secretly had resources. So I lived modestly. I worked the same jobs. I saved carefully. And that investment remained untouched. But sitting there in the kitchen at 3 in the morning, I realized something important. My children believed I was powerless. They believed this house was my only real asset, which meant they believed they could pressure me into giving it up. I took a slow sip of tea and stared at the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten with the first signs of dawn. For the first time since overhearing their conversation, a strange calm settled over me, because if they were planning something, then I needed to understand exactly what they were hiding. The next morning, the house felt different. Ryan and Claire woke up early, already dressed for the day. Daniel joined them in the living room with a laptop open on the coffee table. Luke came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Mom, about last night." My heart skipped slightly, but he didn't continue. Instead, he just shrugged and grabbed a mug. "Smells good," he said. From the living room, I could hear Ryan's voice. "We just need to finalize the numbers," Claire responded. "If we get the funding lined up first, the rest should fall into place." Daniel added something I couldn't quite hear. I carried the coffee into the living room. The conversation stopped immediately. Ryan closed the laptop halfway. Claire smiled a little too quickly. Daniel leaned back casually in his chair. "Morning, Mrs. Anderson," he said. "Good morning," I replied. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ryan cleared his throat. "Mom, actually, we were hoping to talk to you about something later today." Claire nodded. "It's a really exciting opportunity." Daniel smiled. "We think you'll like the idea." I looked at all three of them, Ryan, Claire, Daniel, and then my eyes moved to Luke. He wasn't smiling. In fact, he looked uncomfortable, almost guilty. That tiny expression told me something important. Whatever they were planning, Luke wasn't completely comfortable with it. And that meant there might still be a piece of the boy I raised somewhere inside him. But Ryan and Claire, they looked confident, certain, like people who believed the outcome was already decided. What they didn't know was that after everything I had sacrificed to raise them, I wasn't as powerless as they thought. And if they believed they could manipulate me into giving away my home, they were about to discover something they had completely forgotten. The woman who had survived raising 3 children alone while working 3 jobs was not someone who broke easily. The conversation they wanted to have with me came later that afternoon. By then, the house had settled into a strange tension that I couldn't ignore. Ryan and Claire spent most of the morning in the living room with Daniel speaking quietly over spreadsheets and notes. Every time I walked past, their voices lowered just enough to make it clear that whatever they were discussing wasn't meant for me. Luke, on the other hand, hovered around the kitchen more than usual. He kept opening the refrigerator and closing it again without taking anything out. At one point, he stood by the window, staring out into the backyard like he was trying to gather the courage to say something, but he never did. Around 2 in the afternoon, Ryan finally stepped into the kitchen where I was folding laundry at the table. "Mom," he said carefully, "do you have a few minutes?" I nodded. "Of course." Claire and Daniel joined us a moment later, pulling chairs around the table. The same table where years earlier we had celebrated their acceptance letters to London. Now the mood felt completely different. Ryan took the lead. "We've been thinking a lot about our future here in the States," he began. "That's wonderful," I said politely. Claire leaned forward, her voice smooth and confident. "There's an incredible opportunity right now, Mom. The kind of opportunity that doesn't come along very often." Daniel nodded. "The market is shifting," he added. "Timing is everything." Ryan opened a folder and slid a few printed pages across the table toward me. "Claire and I want to start a consulting firm," he explained. "We've already built strong connections overseas. Daniel has relationships with investors. If we launch here, we could grow quickly." I glanced down at the papers. Charts, numbers, business projections. None of it meant much to me, but the word capital asterisk appeared several times. Claire continued speaking. "The biggest challenge with startups is initial funding," she said. "But we realized something." Her eyes lifted to meet mine. "We already have access to capital." I waited. Ryan took a slow breath. The house. There it was. The word hung in the air exactly as I had expected. Claire spoke quickly as if rehearsed. "If you sold the property, we could use that money to launch the company." Daniel added calmly, "It would be a smart investment. Much better than letting the value sit idle." Idle. I folded the laundry, slowly buying myself a moment before answering. "And where would I live?" I asked. Ryan spoke immediately. "There are plenty of great options." Claire nodded enthusiastically. "Senior communities are actually really nice these days." Daniel smiled politely. "You'd be more comfortable somewhere smaller, less maintenance." I looked at them carefully. Their expressions were calm, rational. They genuinely believed what they were saying made sense. Luke finally spoke from the doorway. "Maybe we should slow down," he said quietly. Claire turned toward him with visible irritation. "Luke, we talked about this." "I know," he replied, "but we shouldn't rush Mom into anything." Ryan exhaled. "Yeah." "We're not rushing her." Then he turned back to me. "Mom, you've always wanted us to succeed. This is our chance." Claire added softly. "And once the company grows, we can take care of you properly." Properly. As if everything I had done for them hadn't been enough. As if the life I had given them needed correcting. For a moment, I didn't respond. Instead, I studied their faces. Ryan's calm confidence, Claire's controlled ambition, Daniel's polite patience, and Luke's uneasy silence. Then I asked the question that had been quietly growing in my mind all morning. "Did your father help you come up with this plan?" The effect was immediate. Ryan froze. Claire's expression hardened. Daniel's eyes flickered with curiosity. Luke looked down at the floor. That silence told me everything. "So Michael's been talking to you," I said softly. Ryan shifted in his chair. "He reached out to us a few years ago." Claire crossed her arms. "He wanted to reconnect." Luke finally spoke again. "He said he regretted leaving." The words hit me like a slow wave. Michael Anderson, the man who had disappeared from our lives almost 2 decades earlier. The man who had left me to raise 3 children alone while he chased a different life. "Where is he now?" I asked. Ryan hesitated. "He's in London." Claire added quickly. "He's had some health problems." Luke spoke quietly. "He's not doing well financially either." Daniel leaned back slightly, watching the conversation unfold with interest. Claire's tone softened, but there was calculation behind it. "He believes this business could help rebuild everything." Ryan nodded. "For all of us." I felt something cold settle inside my chest. For years I had wondered whether Michael had ever thought about us, whether he ever regretted leaving. Now I understood. He hadn't returned because he cared. He had returned because he needed something. Just like the others, Claire continued speaking. "Mom, Dad explained things we never fully understood before." "What things?" I asked. Ryan answered. He said the reason our lives were always so difficult was because you never wanted more. The words were so absurd that for a moment I thought I had misheard them. Claire nodded slowly. "He said you were comfortable living small." Daniel remained silent, but his expression suggested the idea made perfect sense to him. Ryan continued carefully. He told us that if you had made different choices, years ago, our family could have had a completely different life. I stared at them, all three of them. And in that moment, a terrible truth became clear. Michael hadn't just reappeared in their lives. He had rewritten their understanding of the past. He had convinced them that the life I fought so hard to hold together was somehow my fault. Luke finally looked up. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed. "Mom, Dad said you held him back." The room fell silent. I sat there at the kitchen table listening to the echoes of a story I barely recognized. A story where I was the reason our family struggled. A story where my sacrifices didn't matter. A story where the man who abandoned his children was somehow the victim. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then I took a slow breath, because I realized something important. My children believed a version of our past that Michael had carefully constructed for them. A version where I was weak, small, an obstacle. And if they believed that, then they had no idea who I really was. What they didn't know yet was that the story they had been told about their mother was about to collapse completely. For a long moment after Luke spoke those words, Dad said, "You held him back, No one in the kitchen said anything. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument. I looked down at the laundry folded neatly in front of me, running my fingers slowly over the fabric just to keep my hands steady. In all the years since Michael had left, I had imagined this moment many different ways. Sometimes I imagined anger. Sometimes I imagined tears. But the feeling that settled inside me now was something different. It was clarity, because suddenly everything made sense. The distance in my children's voices over the years, the quiet embarrassment when they spoke about our home, the way they talked about success like it belonged to a different class of people. Michael had been whispering to them for years, and he hadn't just been reconnecting with them. He had been rewriting their memories. I slowly lifted my eyes and looked at Ryan first. "You really believe that?" I asked. Ryan didn't answer immediately. He leaned back slightly in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "Mom, Dad explained things we never understood when we were kids." Claire nodded beside him. "He said he wanted more from life," she added. "But you were always satisfied staying here, in this house, in this neighborhood, in the life that had kept them safe, fed, and educated." I turned my gaze to Luke. "Do you believe that too?" Luke shifted uncomfortably. I don't know," he admitted. Claire exhaled in frustration. "Luke, come on, we've talked about this." Ryan leaned forward again. "Mom, we're not trying to hurt you. We're just saying that sometimes people limit themselves without realizing it." Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "In business, it's very common," he said. "People grow comfortable with stability even when bigger opportunities exist." I studied him for a moment. A man who had grown up surrounded by wealth. A man who had probably never wondered how he would pay rent or buy groceries. To him, risk was an exciting strategy. To me, risk had always meant survival. "Let me ask you something," I said quietly. Ryan nodded. "Of course. Do you remember the year Ryan broke his arm?" Ryan blinked, clearly caught off guard. "I was 8, he said slowly. "That's right," I replied. I turned toward Claire. "And do you remember the winter when the heating system broke?" Claire frowned slightly. "Vaguely." Luke looked up. "That was the year we slept in the living room with the space heater," he said. I nodded. "Yes." They watched me carefully now. I continued speaking, my voice steady. "Do you remember how I paid the hospital bill for Ryan's arm?" None of them answered. Because they didn't know. "You were children," I said gently. "You weren't supposed to worry about things like that." I folded the last piece of laundry and placed it on the stack. "Your father didn't leave us with savings," I continued. "He left us with debt." Ryan's brow furrowed. Claire opened her mouth slightly but didn't speak. Luke looked stunned. I went on. "When he left, I had 3 children, a mortgage, and a pile of unpaid credit cards." Daniel shifted in his chair. I could see the surprise in his expression. This was not the version of events Michael had told them. "Your father wasn't chasing opportunity," I said quietly. "He was running from responsibility." Ryan shook his head slowly. "That's not what he told us." "I know," I replied. Claire crossed her arms defensively. "Dad said he had business ideas that you didn't support." I met her gaze calmly. "He had gambling debts," I said. The room went completely silent. Ryan's expression hardened with disbelief. "That's not possible." Luke whispered, "What?" Daniel leaned forward slightly, suddenly very interested. I continued, Michael believed he could win back everything he lost if he just took one more risk, I said. Every time he failed, he borrowed more money. Claire shook her head. He said he left because you refused to believe in him. I believed in him for years, I replied. But believing in someone doesn't mean letting them destroy your family. Ryan rubbed his forehead. You're saying Dad lied to us? I didn't answer that question directly. Instead, I asked one of my own. Did he tell you why collectors used to call the house late at night? Ryan froze. Luke looked at me with wide eyes. Claire's expression began to crack. Did he tell you why I worked 3 jobs after he left? I continued. No one spoke, because the truth that they had been told was beginning to unravel piece by piece. For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Finally, Luke spoke. His voice was quiet. He never mentioned any of that. Of course he hadn't, because the story Michael had given them needed a villain, and he had chosen me. Ryan leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling with the information. Claire stared at the table, her confidence fading. Daniel remained silent, though I could tell his mind was racing. Then Ryan asked the question that mattered most. Why didn't you tell us? I sighed softly. Because you were children, I said. You deserved a chance to grow up without carrying the weight of adult mistakes. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. So you just let us believe his version? I nodded. For a long time, I didn't know he was talking to you. The room felt different now. The certainty that had filled it earlier was gone. But one thing remained unchanged. Ryan finally spoke again. Even with everything I had said, his voice still carried determination. Mom, none of that changes the opportunity we're talking about now. Claire looked up quickly. Ryan. He continued. The past is complicated, but the business idea still makes sense. Daniel nodded slightly. It's still a smart move. Luke looked between them, confused. You're serious right now, he asked. Ryan turned to me. Selling the house could change all of our futures. There it was again. The same plan. The same expectation. Even after the truth about their father had started to surface. And in that moment, I realized something painful. This wasn't just about Michael's lies. Over the years, my children had built their own beliefs about success. Beliefs shaped by wealthy mentors, by elite social circles, by a world that measured value in money and status. And that world had taught them something dangerous. It had taught them that the life I gave them was small. But what they didn't understand yet was that the woman they believed was small had been quietly building a strength they had never bothered to see. And soon they were going to learn exactly how strong their maid really was. After that conversation in the kitchen, something inside me shifted. For years, I had lived with a single purpose, protecting my children from hardship. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar I sent overseas had been guided by that one belief that if they could climb higher than I ever had, then everything I endured would be worth it. But sitting at that table, listening to them calmly discuss selling the only home I had left, I realized something painful. Somewhere along the way, my sacrifices had taught them the wrong lesson. They had learned that my life existed to serve theirs, that anything I owned, anything I worked for, could eventually become theirs if it benefited their ambitions. And maybe that misunderstanding was partly my fault, because I had never once drawn a line. That night, after everyone went to bed, I sat alone in the living room with a notebook and began writing. Not memories, not feelings, plans. For the first time in my life, I wasn't thinking about what was best for my children. I was thinking about what was necessary for me. The next morning, after they left the house to meet Daniel's contacts downtown, I made a phone call. The number was one I hadn't dialed in years. It rang twice before a calm voice answered. Hayes & Associates. Hello, I said carefully. My name is Carol Anderson. I was hoping to speak with Robert Hayes. There was a brief pause. And what is this regarding? I believe Mr. Hayes will remember me, I replied. It concerns Margaret Hayes and an investment agreement from several years ago. Another pause followed. Please hold. A moment later, a familiar voice came on the line. Carol. Hearing my name spoken with recognition surprised me. Yes, I said softly. Hello, Robert. Robert Hayes was Margaret Hayes' son. Years earlier, when Margaret had offered me a small stake in her company's hotel expansion project, Robert had been the lawyer who finalized the paperwork. At the time, I barely understood the legal language in those documents, but Robert had explained everything carefully. You still own the shares, he told me then. They'll grow with the company. Back then, I had simply nodded. I never imagined how important that investment might eventually become. Carol, it's been a long time, Robert said now. How have you been? I've been well, I replied politely. Then I hesitated. There's something I need to discuss with you. His voice became more serious. Of course. I explained the situation carefully. Not every emotional detail, just the facts. My children had returned home. They were pressuring me to sell my house, and I wanted to understand exactly where I stood financially before making any decisions. Robert listened quietly. When I finished, he said something that made my heart skip. Carol, you do remember that your shares have appreciated significantly over the years, right? I assumed they had grown somewhat, I said cautiously. He chuckled softly. That's an understatement. There was a sound of papers shifting on his desk. Margaret's expansion projects were extremely successful, he continued. The company now owns several hotels across the Midwest. I held the phone tighter. And my portion. Your original percentage was small, Robert said. But after reinvestments and dividends, he paused briefly. It's worth considerably more than when you first received it. My throat felt dry. How much more? There was a brief silence on the line. Then Robert gave me a number. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. That can't be right, I whispered. It is, he replied calmly. I closed my eyes trying to absorb the information. All those years I'd believed I was barely holding my life together financially. And yet quietly in the background something had been growing. Not enough to make me wealthy by the standards of people like Daniel Bennett, but more than enough to change the situation. My children thought they understood. You've never touched the dividends, Robert continued. They've been reinvested automatically. I let out a slow breath. So technically, yes, he said gently, you are financially stable. Stable. The word felt strange. For decades, survival had been my only financial goal. Now, for the first time, I realized something important. My children believed the house was my only safety net. They believed that if they could convince me to sell it, they would gain control of my future. But the truth was very different. I wasn't trapped. I wasn't powerless. And most importantly, I didn't need their permission to protect what was mine. Robert, I said carefully, there's something else I need. Go on. I want to review the legal protections around my house. You're worried about them pressuring you into signing something, he said. Yes. That's wise, Robert replied. There was another brief pause. Carol, if you'd like, we could arrange a meeting. I can review your documents and make sure everything is secure. I'd appreciate that, I said. We scheduled an appointment for later that week. After I hung up the phone, I sat quietly in the living room for a long time. The sunlight from the window fell across the old wooden floor. This house had carried me through the hardest years of my life. It had sheltered my children, protected us from storms, given us a place to belong. And now those same children believed they could convince me to give it up for their ambitions. For years, I had believed my strength came from sacrifice. But that morning, I realized something else. Strength also comes from knowing when to stop sacrificing. Later that afternoon, the front door opened. Ryan, Claire, Luke, and Daniel walked in talking excitedly about meetings and potential investors. Claire looked energized. Mom, we've made incredible progress today, she said. Ryan nodded. This opportunity is even bigger than we thought. Daniel smiled politely at me. The timing is perfect. Luke said nothing. I studied their faces quietly. Ryan's determination, Claire's ambition, Daniel's confidence, and Luke's growing uncertainty. They believed the next step in their plan was simple. Convince me. Sell the house. Fund the business. What they didn't know yet was that the woman they thought they could pressure into surrendering everything had just discovered she had far more power than they ever imagined, and I was about to use it. Over the next few days, the atmosphere inside the house changed. Ryan and Claire moved through the rooms with a sense of quiet urgency, constantly discussing numbers, meetings, and projections. Their conversations with Daniel grew more intense, filled with terms that sounded more like strategy sessions than family discussions. Luke, on the other hand, seemed increasingly restless. He spent less time in the living room with the others and more time outside on the back porch, staring into the yard, like he was trying to remember something he had lost. As for me, I kept my routine as normal as possible. I went to work at the hotel. I waited tables at the diner. I sewed clothes late into the evening. But behind the routine, something had shifted. For the first time in years, I was no longer reacting to what life threw at me. I was preparing. 2 days after my phone call with Robert Hayes, I drove downtown to meet him at his office. The Hayes & Associates building was taller than I remembered. Glass windows reflected the city's skyline, and the lobby floors gleamed under soft lights. Walking through those doors felt strange. For most of my life, buildings like this belonged to another world. A world where decisions were made in conference rooms rather than kitchen tables. Robert Hayes greeted me personally. He looked older than the last time I had seen him, but his sharp eyes still carried the calm intelligence I remembered. "Carol," he said warmly, shaking my hand. "It's good to see you again." "Thank you for meeting with me," I replied. He led me into his office and gestured toward a chair. "Let's take a look at your situation." For the next hour, Robert reviewed every document related to my property. The mortgage, the loan agreements, the deed. Occasionally he asked questions. "How long have your children been living with you again?" "A week." "Have they asked you to sign anything yet?" "Not yet." He nodded thoughtfully. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Carol, legally speaking, your house is completely secure," he said. I felt a small wave of relief. "As long as you don't sign anything transferring ownership or authority, no one can force you to sell it." "What about pressure?" I asked quietly. Robert's expression softened slightly. "Family pressure isn't a legal tool," he said, "but it can be powerful emotionally." I nodded. "I understand that." He tapped one of the documents on the desk. "If they attempt to present paperwork, especially anything involving power of attorney, do not sign it without bringing it to me first." "I won't." Robert studied me carefully. "Do you believe they intend to push you into that?" I thought about the conversation I had overheard in the hallway, about Ryan mentioning legal consultants, about Claire calling the house dead capital. "Yes," I said honestly. He nodded slowly. "Then it might be wise to confront the situation in a controlled environment." "What do you mean?" "Invite them to a meeting," Robert suggested. "If they truly believe this business plan is legitimate, they should have no problem discussing it in front of legal counsel." The idea made sense. If their intentions were as straightforward as they claimed, they wouldn't object. And if they were hiding something, that meeting would expose it. "I'll think about it," I said. Robert smiled slightly. "Carol, I've worked with a lot of people over the years." He leaned forward. "Most financial conflicts aren't really about money." "What are they about?" I asked. "Control." The word lingered in the room, because deep down I already knew he was right. When I returned home that afternoon, I found Ryan and Claire sitting with Daniel at the dining table again. Spreadsheets covered the surface. Luke stood near the window, arms crossed. Ryan looked up when I entered. "Mom, perfect timing," he said. Claire smiled brightly. "We've been refining the business plan." Daniel added, "The numbers are looking very promising." I set my purse on the counter and waited. Ryan exchanged a quick glance with Claire. Then he reached into a folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. "Actually," he said carefully, "there's something we'd like you to look at." I recognized the shape of legal documents immediately. My heart didn't race the way it might have a week earlier. Now I simply watched. Claire slid the papers across the table toward me. "It's just a temporary arrangement," she said smoothly. Ryan nodded. "A legal authorization so we can manage the property sale and reinvest the funds." Power of attorney. Exactly what I had expected. Daniel leaned back in his chair, observing quietly. "It's a very standard process," he added. Luke stepped forward suddenly. "Maybe we shouldn't do this today," he said. Claire frowned. "Luke, we've already discussed this." Ryan looked at him sharply. "We're not forcing anything." But Luke's eyes moved toward me. "Mom hasn't even had time to think about it yet." I slowly picked up the papers. The legal language was dense, but I recognized enough to understand the purpose. Temporary authority, asset management, property liquidation, everything Robert had warned me about. Claire watched my face closely. "It's really just paperwork," she said gently. Ryan added, "Once the company is running, we'll take care of everything." Daniel finally spoke again. "You'd be helping your children build something significant." I looked at each of them. Ryan's determination, Claire's ambition, Daniel's calculated calm, and Luke's growing unease. For a moment, the room was silent. Then I placed the papers back on the table. "I'll need time to review this," I said. Ryan nodded, though I could see impatience behind his expression. "Of course." Claire forced a smile. "Just don't take too long. Timing matters with investments." Daniel said nothing. Luke exhaled quietly. I picked up my purse again. "There's something else," I added. Ryan looked up. "What's that?" "If this is such a good opportunity," I said calmly, "you won't mind discussing it with my lawyer." Claire blinked. "Your lawyer." Ryan's expression tightened. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. Luke looked relieved. "Yes," I continued. "We can all sit down together and review everything." The room grew very quiet. Because in that moment, their carefully prepared plan had encountered something they hadn't expected: resistance. And what they didn't realize yet was that the meeting I had just suggested was going to change everything they thought they knew about their mother. The moment I mentioned my lawyer, the energy in the room shifted. It was subtle, but I noticed it immediately. Ryan's fingers stopped tapping against the table. Claire's confident smile stiffened slightly. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more thoughtful. And Luke looked relieved. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Ryan cleared his throat. "A lawyer," he repeated. "Yes," I said calmly. Claire gave a small laugh, though it sounded forced. "Mom, that's really not necessary," she said. "This is just a family matter." Daniel remained quiet, observing the exchange carefully. Ryan leaned forward. "We're not trying to pressure you," he said. "We just thought it would be easier to handle everything internally." I folded my arms gently on the table. Maybe I replied, but since the house is my only property, I'd feel more comfortable having someone review the documents. Daniel finally spoke. "That's actually reasonable," he said. Ryan glanced toward him quickly. Daniel shrugged slightly. "If the plan is solid, legal review shouldn't be a problem." Claire's jaw tightened. Ryan hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Fine," he said, "if that makes you feel better." Luke spoke quietly from beside the window. "I think it's a good idea." Claire shot him a look but didn't argue. "All right," she said. "When do you want to do this meeting?" "I've already scheduled it," I replied. Ryan blinked. "You already?" "This Friday," I said, "at Robert Hayes' office." The reaction this time was stronger. Daniel's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Hayes and Associates?" he asked. "Yes." He leaned back in his chair thoughtfully. "That's a reputable firm." Ryan looked between us. "You've worked with them before." "A long time ago," I said simply. Claire picked up the documents again, flipping through them. "Well," she said slowly, "if a lawyer's involved, it might actually help structure things better." Daniel nodded. "That's true. Investors prefer clean legal frameworks." Ryan relaxed slightly. "See," he said, looking at me. "This could work out even better." But Luke remained quiet. And when I glanced at him, I noticed something different in his eyes. Not relief. Concern? That evening, the house was strangely calm. Ryan and Claire spent most of the night reviewing their presentation materials. Daniel sat with them, occasionally offering suggestions. Luke stayed outside on the porch again. When I stepped outside to join him, he looked up quickly. "Hey, Mom, mind if I sit?" I asked. Of course not. We sat side by side in the old porch chairs that had been there since the kids were little. The backyard was quiet. The same maple tree still stood near the fence. The same swing hung from one of its branches. Luke stared at it for a long time. "I used to spend hours on that thing," he said. "I remember," I replied. "You used to push me," he continued. "Until you got dizzy," I said with a small smile. Luke laughed softly. For a moment, the tension between us disappeared. Then his expression grew serious again. "Mom, yes. Are you mad at us?" I considered the question carefully. "I'm hurt," I said honestly. Luke nodded slowly. I figured. He rubbed his hands together nervously. Ryan and Claire really believe this business could change everything. I know. But something about it just doesn't feel right to me, he admitted. "What part?" Luke hesitated. "All of it." He looked down at the porch floor. "The pressure. The way Daniel talks about money. The way Claire keeps saying we need to move fast." I stayed quiet. Luke sighed. "Dad always said you were afraid of big opportunities," he continued. "But the more I think about it, the less that makes sense." He turned toward me. "You worked 3 jobs for years," he said. "That doesn't sound like someone who's afraid of risk." I felt something tighten in my chest, because Luke was beginning to see the truth. "I just don't want you to feel like we're taking advantage of you," he added. I placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for saying that." Luke looked relieved. "But Ryan and Claire won't listen to me," he said. "They think I'm being emotional." "That's because you still are," I replied softly. "What do you mean?" "You still remember what this house means," I said. Luke looked back toward the maple tree. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked something quietly. "Do you think Dad lied to us?" The question hung in the cool evening air. I didn't answer immediately, because I knew the truth would eventually reveal itself without me needing to force it. Sometimes, I said carefully, people tell stories that make them feel better about the choices they've made. Luke nodded slowly. "I guess that makes sense." Then he stood up. "I should probably get back inside before Claire thinks I've disappeared." I watched him walk toward the door. Before he went inside, he turned back. "Mom." "Yes. I'm glad you're bringing a lawyer into this." "So am I," said quietly. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room again. The house was quiet, but this time the silence didn't feel lonely. It felt like the calm before something inevitable. Friday was only 2 days away, and that meeting at Robert Hayes' office was going to reveal more than my children expected, because Ryan and Claire believed they understood the financial situation. They believed the house was my only real asset. They believed they had already calculated every possible outcome. But they were missing one very important piece of information, a piece of information that would completely change the balance of power in the room. And when that truth came out, my children were finally going to see their mother in a way they never had before. Friday morning arrived faster than I expected. The entire house felt tense before anyone had even spoken. Ryan woke up early, already dressed in a sharp suit that looked like it belonged in a boardroom rather than a family meeting. Claire wore a tailored blazer and heels, her expression focused and determined. Daniel appeared just as composed as always, calm and confident in a dark coat. Luke came downstairs last. He looked like he hadn't slept well. I finished my coffee slowly while watching them move around the kitchen. No one mentioned the meeting directly, but the reason for the tension was obvious. Today was the day everything would be discussed openly. Ryan finally broke the silence. "So, we're meeting your lawyer at 10. "Yes," I replied. Claire checked the time on her phone. "That gives us about 30 minutes to get there." Daniel stood near the doorway. "Shall we—" The drive downtown was quiet. Ryan focused on the road. Claire reviewed notes on her phone. Daniel stared out the window. Luke sat beside me in the back seat, his hands folded together nervously. When we arrived at Hayes and Associates, Ryan's eyebrows lifted slightly as he looked up at the building. "I didn't realize this firm was this large," he said. Claire nodded. "They handle some major corporate clients." Daniel's expression carried quiet interest. "Your mother has good taste in legal counsel," he said. We entered the lobby together and checked in at the front desk. A few minutes later, Robert Hayes himself appeared to greet us. "Carol," he said warmly. "Robert," I replied. He shook my hand and then looked at the others. "These must be your children." Ryan stepped forward confidently. "Ryan Anderson?" "Claire Anderson," Claire added. Daniel extended his hand. "Daniel Bennett." Robert nodded politely. "And you must be Luke." Luke smiled slightly. "Yes, sir." Robert gestured toward the hallway. "Please come with me." We followed him into a spacious conference room. A long wooden table filled the center of the room with large windows overlooking the city skyline. Ryan and Claire immediately placed their folders on the table. Daniel took a seat near the end. Luke sat quietly beside me. Robert sat across from us and folded his hands calmly. So he said, "Carol mentioned there's a business proposal that involves her property." Ryan nodded. "That's correct." Claire slid a stack of documents across the table. "We're planning to launch a consulting firm here in the States," she explained. "The house would provide the initial capital." Robert opened the folder and began reading carefully. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the soft turning of pages. Ryan and Claire watched him expectantly. Daniel remained relaxed. Luke stared down at the table. Finally, Robert closed the folder. "I see," he said thoughtfully. Ryan leaned forward. "Is there a problem?" Robert glanced toward me briefly before answering. "The structure of this agreement transfers temporary authority over Carol's property to you," he said. "That's standard," Claire replied quickly. "For certain business arrangements, yes," Robert said calmly, "but it carries significant risk." Ryan frowned. "What kind of risk?" "If the investment fails," Robert explained, "Carol would lose her home." Claire crossed her arms. "But the investment won't fail." Daniel spoke smoothly. "All business ventures carry risk," he admitted, "but calculated risk leads to growth." Robert nodded. "That may be true." He looked directly at Ryan and Claire. "But the question isn't whether the business might succeed. The question is why Carol would need to risk her only home when she already has other financial assets." The room went silent. Ryan blinked. "Other assets?" Claire looked confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. Robert opened a second folder. Inside were several documents I had reviewed with him earlier that week. "Carol Anderson," he said calmly, "owns a small but valuable equity share in Hayes Hospitality Group." Ryan frowned. "I'm sorry, what?" Claire stared at me. "Mom?" Luke looked equally surprised. Robert continued. "That investment was granted to her many years ago by Margaret Hayes." Daniel leaned forward. "How valuable is that share?" Robert looked at the documents again. After several decades of reinvestment and growth, he paused briefly. It is currently worth more than enough to cover the capital your proposed business requires. The silence in the room became absolute. Ryan slowly turned toward me. You have that kind of money? Claire's voice came out barely above a whisper. Why didn't you ever tell us? Luke looked stunned. Mom! Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly reassessing the situation. I met my children's eyes calmly, because I didn't want you building your lives around the idea that money would solve everything. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. You mean this whole time? Yes, I said gently. I had options. Claire shook her head in disbelief. So you let us think the house was your only asset? I nodded. That house was never about money. I looked around the table. It was about home. Ryan leaned back in his chair, clearly struggling to process the information. Claire's confidence had completely disappeared. Luke looked like he was finally seeing me clearly for the first time in years. Daniel spoke carefully. So theoretically, Carol could invest in the company without selling the house. Robert nodded. That is correct. Ryan looked between me and Robert. You're saying the business could still happen? I took a slow breath. That depends. Claire leaned forward. On what? I looked at each of them one by one. On whether you understand something first. Ryan frowned. What? I met his gaze calmly. My life was never small. The words hung in the room. For years, I continued quietly. I worked hard so you could chase bigger dreams. But that doesn't mean the life I built was something to be ashamed of. Claire lowered her eyes. Luke looked close to tears. Ryan didn't speak. Daniel remained silent, watching carefully. Then I said the one thing they had never expected to hear. I'm not selling my house. No one argued. Because suddenly they all understood something they had completely misunderstood about their mother. I had never been powerless. I had simply been patient. The silence after my words felt almost surreal. For a moment, no one in the conference room moved. Ryan stared at the documents in front of him like they might suddenly rearrange themselves into something easier to understand. Claire's confidence, so sharp and certain, just an hour earlier had completely dissolved. Luke sat quietly beside me, his eyes moving between my face and the papers on the table. Daniel Bennett, for the first time since I had met him, looked genuinely uncertain. Robert Hayes simply folded his hands and waited. Finally, Ryan spoke. You had this the whole time, he said slowly. Yes, I replied. We've done, and you never told us. No. Ryan leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. For a moment, I thought he might be angry. Instead, he looked embarrassed. Claire was the next to speak. Why, she asked quietly. The question carried none of the sharpness it had earlier, just confusion. I looked at her. Because I wanted you to build your lives based on effort, not entitlement. Claire swallowed. And the house? The house, I said, was never about money. I turned slightly in my chair and looked out the window at the skyline beyond the conference room. That house is where you learned to walk, I continued, where you studied for your exams, where you came home crying after bad days at school. Luke nodded slowly. Ryan looked down at the table. To me, I said softly, that place is not an asset. It's a life. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Luke did something unexpected. He stood up. He walked around the table, and he hugged me. Not the quick, polite hug he had given me when they first arrived home. A real hug, the kind that lasts longer than a few seconds. I'm sorry, Mom, he said quietly. The words landed gently in the room. I felt my chest tighten slightly. I should have said something sooner. I placed my hand on his back. You're saying it now. Ryan rubbed his face with his hands. I feel like an idiot, he muttered. Claire let out a shaky breath. We thought... She stopped. Ryan finished the sentence. We thought you were stuck. I nodded. I know. Claire looked up at me, guilt clear in her eyes. And we made you feel small. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was complicated. Yes, I said eventually. You did. The honesty in the room felt heavier than anything that had happened before. Daniel cleared his throat gently. Well, he said, this has certainly changed the financial landscape of the conversation. Ryan almost laughed. That's one way to put it. Daniel looked at me thoughtfully. Mrs. Anderson, he said, for what it's worth. I misjudged you. That seems to be a common theme lately, I replied calmly. He nodded once. Fair. Robert Hayes stood from his chair. Well, he said since the property sale is no longer necessary, I believe the next step would be deciding whether Carol wishes to invest in this business at all. Ryan looked at me carefully. Do you? I leaned back in my chair. For a long time, I had lived for my children's futures. But now, for the first time, the decision truly belonged to me. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Claire nodded. That's fair. Luke returned to his seat beside me. Ryan looked around the room, his expression thoughtful. I think we need to rethink a lot of things, he admitted. Daniel agreed. Business plans can change, he said. Family relationships are harder to repair. No one argued with that. The meeting ended shortly afterward. As we walked out of the building together, the mood was very different from when we had entered. Ryan walked beside me instead of ahead of me. Claire stayed unusually quiet. Luke remained close. Daniel lingered slightly behind us, giving the family space. When we reached the parking lot, Ryan finally spoke again. Mom. Yes. I don't expect forgiveness right away, he said. I know, I replied. Claire looked down at the pavement. We were ashamed of the wrong things. Luke nodded. We forgot where we came from. I looked at the three of them. My children, older now, more complicated, more flawed than I had once imagined, but still mine. You don't need to erase your ambition, I said gently, but you do need to remember the people who stood behind you when you had none. Ryan nodded slowly. Claire wiped her eyes. Luke squeezed my shoulder. We drove home together that afternoon. The same house waited for us when we arrived. The paint was still faded. The furniture was still old. The kitchen still smelled faintly like cinnamon from the pie I had baked days earlier. But something had changed. For the first time since they returned, my children didn't look at the house like it was a problem to solve. They looked at it like it was part of them. And that was the beginning of something I hadn't expected. Not revenge, not victory, something better, understanding, and maybe slowly, healing. Looking back on everything that happened, I've realized something important about family sacrifice and the quiet strength that often goes unseen. For many years, I believed love meant giving everything, every hour, every dollar, every piece of yourself. But love without boundaries can sometimes teach the wrong lesson. It can make people believe your sacrifices are obligations instead of gifts. It can make them forget the cost of the life they were given. My children didn't become cruel people overnight. They were influenced by new worlds, new expectations, and voices that told them success meant distancing themselves from the past. But the truth is this: there is no success that requires you to erase the people who helped you become who you are. Hard work is not something to be ashamed of. Being a waitress, a housekeeper, or a seamstress does not make someone small. What truly makes a person small is forgetting gratitude. The most important thing I learned through all of this is that dignity matters. No matter how much you love your family, you must protect your dignity. Because when you respect yourself, you teach others how to respect you too. My children are still learning that lesson, and so am I. But healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens one honest conversation at a time. Now I'd like to ask you something. If you were in my position, would you have forgiven them? Or would you have walked away? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. I read as many of them as I can, and your stories often remind me that none of us face life's hardest moments alone. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own family, your own sacrifices, or your own journey, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep stories like this alive. And wherever you're watching from, tell me your city and the time there right now. I'd love to know who's listening tonight.